So we're going to move into our next section. It's going to kind of be two chapters that some of you may not think really go together, but there's really no other way for us to do this unless we took a test on each chapter. What we need to now do, we've spent most of our time so far looking at bacteria and things that are more specific to them. Now we're going to look at two groups that are not bacteria. We're going to do chapter 12, and that's going to look at the eukaryotes that are microscopic. And then connected to this is going to be chapter 13, which covers viruses. Right? Chapter 12 is a very short chapter. There's not a whole lot in it. I kind of think of chapter 12 more as an overview chapter because some of these characteristics we can't truly understand until we get to the diseases, which for some reason they always put in the end of a textbook. They save the really fun stuff for last. Now, we're not going to talk about diseases today. There may be times when I throw some things in there just to help explain something, but as far as when you start studying chapter 12 for a test or anything like that, I'm not going to ask you any disease-specific questions as of right now. We're just looking at the 4 different groups of eukaryotes kind of as an overview. Now, because of the way the recording typically works, every time I've ever tried to record this and show you the YouTube videos in the middle, it like screws up the recording and messes the computer up. It's just too much for it. So I'm going to go through all the material, and then at the end, I'm going to show you guys some videos, and then I'll show you the actual organisms and all those things. Now, I feel like I need to give you the warning. This is one of those classes where I'm probably going to show you some things that are kind of gross to some people. Okay, so if you don't like, not necessarily bloody things, but if the idea of seeing a worm crawling out of somebody's body bothers you, then some of these videos may be a little much for some of you. If you're not required to watch them, when it comes time for the videos, if you want to go out of the room, you can. I had a student one summer, a guy. He was the only guy in my class. And every time we went over diseases, he would move a chair out in the hallway, and he would sit outside. And he would listen to lecture, but he had to do it outside because he couldn't look at any of the pictures of the diseases or anything like that. Okay. Well, now the projector just lost its mind. All right, so we're all going to start having seizures from the blinking. All right, so I'm going to go on the board, but I'm going to leave my screen up to make sure that I'm going to follow along in the notes of what you guys are looking at, okay? And then at the end, we may just have to kind of crowd around the computer to look at some of the videos and let me show you that stuff, okay? We do the best we can. I know what's going on with the projector. All right, so have you all got your notes printed out so you can kind of follow along with what we're doing? Okay, if you can't, otherwise you're not going to be able to see what I'm looking at. All right. So we have 4 groups of eukaryotes to go through. We have, before we start, why are these eukaryotes? What makes them eukaryotic cells? What do they have? Membranes around their organelles, specifically their nucleus. Okay, the cell wall is wrong. There's a difference between a cell wall and a membrane. Okay, so we're talking about these are more complex organisms. They are all going to have organelles. Most of them are going to have all the organelles we went through. Like, of course, they're going to have a nucleus. They all are going to pretty much have mitochondria, ribosomes, rough ER, smooth ER, all those organelles that we went over in chapter 4. We're going to see that in all these eukaryotic cells. Okay. And we're going to start with fungi. And when you think about a fungus, what immediately comes to mind? What do you think of? A mushroom, right? That's what most people immediately think of. We're going to talk about mushrooms because mushrooms are obviously macroscopic, right? Okay, so we're going to leave that for another class. We're only going to talk about 2 groups of fungi, the microscopic ones. We're going to talk about molds and yeast. Okay, so have you ever seen mold or yeast with the naked eye? Yeah, right. You've seen that. We've all seen mold on bread, cheese, anything like that. Well, when you can see it with your naked eye, the microscopic mold has been there for quite a long time. So if you walked to get a piece of bread today and you saw a little speck of mold on your bread, 3 or 4 days ago that mold was already there. You just couldn't see it at that point. Have any of you ever seen yeast with the naked eye? What do you think? Have you ever wiped behind your ear or your child's ear and saw something a little white? Kind of white and flaky? Any parents have probably wiped their kids. If you haven't, you need to wipe your kids' ears. Because if you've wiped your kids' ears, you've seen little white flakes every now and then. That's yeast. You have them behind your ears too, all over your body. In the morning, take you a colored washcloth or something colored before you take a shower and wipe behind your ear, and you'll see teeny tiny little white specks, and that's large clusters of yeast on your body. Okay? Now, so let's talk in general about just basic characteristics of fungi. Why are they interesting? Number one most important thing about a fungus to us is that they are saprobes. The word saprobe is a word we use to describe something that is a decomposer. And you may think, well, that doesn't sound really important. Why do I care if there's anything that decomposes? What do you think the earth would look like if every tree that ever fell down was still there? It'd be pretty crowded, right? But every time any organic matter dies in the forest, in the woods, whatever you want to call it, there is going to be some sort of fungus that begins growing on it. The fungus, its job is to break it down. When it breaks it down, it's not doing that just to clear the path for the humans to walk through. That fungus is breaking it down into very small components. It's fixing the nitrogen in a way that plants can use it. So it actually takes a dead plant and changes it into a form of nitrogen that a new living plant can then use and incorporate and grow. So it's kind of like the great circle of life, right? That we watched the Lion King movie and we all know what the circle of life is. It's a very important thing that they do for us. You've probably at some point, especially since you live in Mississippi, you have probably walked through the woods and you've probably seen a dead tree or something laying down that had mushrooms growing on it. That's what those mushrooms were doing. They were eating that dead tree. They were living off of it and breaking it down. There were tons of other fungi on there. You just couldn't see them because the other ones were microscopic. You could only see the mushrooms. Something kind of similar that they can do is some of your fungi form what we call mycorrhiza. I'm sure I'll spell this wrong, but you get the point. Mycorrhiza are a mutualistic relationship between fungi and plants. Okay? Have you ever been doing any gardening or anything like that and you pulled up a flower or a bush or something and you saw what looked like white spiderwebby looking things when you dug it up? Most people think that looks gross and they'll kind of dig it and throw it away. That's a very good thing. Those white things are the mycorrhiza. The way it works, a plant has roots, right? Roots go in the dirt. What's the job of the roots? Absorb nutrients and water, right? Well, if I'm the plant, I can only touch water that my legs are long enough to touch, right, if my legs are the roots. Okay? So if there's no water right here or no nutrition right here, as a plant, I would die. What the fungus will do, it will run from the root of the plant and spread out the surface area. It kind of acts to pull the water and the nutrition to the plant. So it helps the plant to get water, get nutrition. It can grow better, grow faster. And then at the same time, it can also feed off of certain things that the plant releases. So they have a nice little relationship going. If we did not have these fungi to help the plants grow, our ability to grow plants and food and different things like that would diminish greatly. So if you do like to garden, don't ever throw the white spiderwebby looking stuff away. Put it back in the ground as you plant things. It's really, really good for your plants. Every now and then it'll get kind of a nodule look to it too. That's all the same thing, it's just different species. Other things that a fungus does for us is not necessarily required things, but we're pretty glad that they do them for us. We use fungi to make lots of things that we eat and drink. Okay, what do we use yeast to make? Bread and wine, liquors. Okay? If we didn't have yeast to make the bread and the wine for us, our life would probably be a little bit different than it is now. And we may not think that here because we live in the United States and we have access to anything we want. There's some places in the world where bread is kind of a staple food. when they get a loaf of bread, they have really accomplished something. They don't just go to Walmart and buy bread. It's a very important thing. All right. Something else they do for us is fungi are the reason that we have antibiotics. Our very first antibiotic came from a mold. What's the first antibiotic called? Penicillin. Okay, and the way it worked, I think I've told you guys this story before. Alexander Fleming in 1929, he was a microbiologist. He was trying to grow bacteria. He plated his bacteria on the petri dish just like you guys do in lab. He came back the next day, and there was something hairy growing on his petri dish. He thought he had messed up, right? He had contaminated his plate, and there was a mold growing on it. What he did, though, before he threw it away, he had a very intelligent thought. He decided, you know, it's kind of funny that the bacteria aren't growing anywhere near where that mold is growing. I bet that mold is making something that's keeping the bacteria from growing. Many years later, we were able to purify that something that killed bacteria, and that's what penicillin was. Back in the 1950s, 1960s, if you got a shot of penicillin, that was made from a vat of mold growing. Then they killed the mold, purified the penicillin out, and they injected that right into your arm. Very, very painful. Nowadays we don't do that anymore. We make antibiotics in the lab, but we wouldn't know what to make if we hadn't got the first one from a fungus. So pretty important. Okay. Now it's actually quite hard to get sick from a fungus. So when we get to the part on diseases, we're not going to see too many fungal diseases. Most of them are really just good guys, kind of out there living and doing their thing, not really worried about us. Fungi are chemoheterotrophs. They're not usually parasites. Do y'all remember, have we talked about the word chemoheterotroph yet? I don't think we have. Okay? We've talked about what it means, though. Okay? A chemoheterotroph is an organism that ingests food from another source and produces chemical energy. You are a chemoheterotroph. Do you get your food from somewhere else? Yeah, you don't do photosynthesis, right? The purpose of photosynthesis was to make sugar. We don't do that. If we want to eat something, we have to get that food, that sugar, from some other source and ingest it. When we get sugar in our body, we break that sugar down to make what? ATP, right? We learned how we do that back in chapter 5. Okay? Fungi are much more like us than they are like plants. They're eating those dead plants as a way to ingest food into their body and break it down. They could really care less about living on us or in us. We're really not good for them. Now, the fungi that are pathogenic, some of them can get really nasty. Some of them are kind of basic. A lot of times if you get a fungal infection, it's going to be an opportunistic infection where something else made you sick and then you got a little fungal infection. Those aren't bad. The ones that are bad are the ones that only people with AIDS or some severe cancers, people with really depressed immune systems, they can get the bad ones. But for the most part, a fungus does not want to live on us. Okay, so let's look a little bit more closely at the two groups we're talking about. I know you can't see it up there, but just look at it with me on your piece of paper. Okay, so we have two groups. We have molds and we have yeast. Okay. So if I were to draw a picture of a mold, I would need to start with kind of a little circle. Okay? That little circle would represent a spore. That's how a mold starts. Okay? The mold spores are floating through the air. The mold spore lands and it germinates. The spore then becomes the body of the mold, which is called the thallus. Okay? As the mold continues to grow and expand, get bigger and bigger, it shoots out long filamentous growths. I know this is looking like a palm tree. It's not supposed to. Okay, but you have these long arm-like extensions coming out. Each of these little arms that are coming out, those are called hyphae. A hypha would be one. Hyphae are multiple. The reason the mold is making all of these little arms, these little hyphae to extend out, is because in each one of these little arms, there are millions of new spores. So if I'm this mold right here and I want to reproduce, what do I need to do? How did this mold start? As a spore, right? When that mold wants to make more of himself, he just breaks open a hyphae and hundreds of thousands of spores hit the air, float, land somewhere else, and then another spore becomes a thallus, starts making hyphae. Do you think a mold can grow pretty fast? Extremely fast. Okay. Have any of you ever had the idea, say you mix up your tuna or your chicken salad, right? You're ready for that sandwich. You go to get your bread, you pull out a piece, and it's got mold on it. It's pretty depressing, right? So you just take that piece that had mold on it and you throw it away, right? Take a few extra ones out just for good measure, and then you find some pieces that don't have mold on them. Usually you smell them because that makes you feel better, right? And then you make your sandwich. Have you ever done that? Usually everybody in the room says, no, you're lying. You've all done that to some degree before. I make the joke, and it's really not a joke. Like, I've been at my grandmother's house eating before, and you'd see that one roll that was like, looked like somebody had pinched a piece off. And that's probably the piece that had the little bit of mold on it, so she just pinched the mold off and then cooked the rolls. So if you've ever eaten at your grandparents' house, they lived in the Depression, you've eaten moldy bread. Okay? So what do you think was happening in that bag of bread, right? Was there really just mold in that one spot that I could see? No. That one spot of mold you could see, it's actually called a mycelium. It just means there's so much of it. You can see it with the naked eye. Every one of those little things that look kind of hairy, those were hyphae that were full of spores. So what was that bag of bread full of? Spores. And those spores had gone and landed on every piece of bread in that bag. Okay? So since I say we've all eaten that before, is that going to hurt us? No, as long as you eat it in small doses. If you took it upon yourself to eat 10 bags of really moldy bread, that may give you a stomachache. I'm not going to say it wouldn't, but overall, it's not going to hurt you. Just using it as a way of explaining to you how fast they can grow. Okay. Now, if we wanted to learn lots of detail about this, we could. I'm not going to make you learn too many details. The spores can be sexual or asexual, meaning you can have lots of genetic adaptations. This one mold can actually produce sexual spores that can interact with other sexual spores of another mold, and you can get crossbreeding. And so you could actually get some molds that are pretty tough to get rid of, and that's kind of what's been more the theme, what's been going on with why we're having to come up with lots of new cleaners and different things, because the molds are kind of changing a little bit, but kind of a little bit beyond the scope of what we're supposed to be doing in here. Okay, so that's our mold. Kind of looks almost like a plant under the microscope, right? You got the center part, and you got all these little arms sticking out. Okay, if I was going to draw yeast on the board, there it is. What did I draw? A circle. Because all yeast are, they are just unicellular organisms. They are one simple eukaryotic cell. They don't really have to even be around another yeast to grow and do their thing. They're just one cell. They're actually kind of similar to bacteria in a lot of ways. Since they just are made of one cell, do you think they're going to reproduce with spores? Doesn't make any sense, right? What they do is they reproduce by a method called budding. And this one little cell will replicate his DNA and then slowly start pushing a bubble out of the cell membrane and the cell wall. And then as time goes by, that bubble gets a little bit bigger, keeps on going until you end up with two pieces that are about the same size. The two cells pinch off, and you end up with two cells that looked exactly like the original cell. So does this kind of look like binary fission? It's very similar to the binary fission we talked about with bacteria. The only difference is it's a little bit slower process, because that one cell has to almost, I don't know how to describe it, you have to see the second cell growing out of the first cell. It has to bud off. And that process takes a little bit longer, because you have the one cell that's kind of bearing the the blunt of having to do all of the work. Where with the bacteria, we saw it was that one cell just produced everything, merged, and split. That was binary fission. So budding is similar, but a little bit different. So which of these do you think can reproduce faster? Molds. Which of these do we have living in our body at all times? Just yeast. Yeast are the only ones you have living on you normally. Okay, so where am I going with this? Which ones do you think are going to most likely make you sick? If you get a mold inside of your body, it's much more likely to make you sick faster than a yeast. All right? Because your body has no clue what to do with this mold, and it's not supposed to be there. Now, you may get sick really fast, but your immune system, it's going to say, wait a minute, that mold is weird, right? That mold ain't supposed to be in here. And your immune system will attack that mold very, very quickly. If you get a yeast in your body that's a different species of yeast than the one that's normally in you, you think your immune system's going to react quite as fast? Because it's used to yeast being there. So sometimes your immune system is actually a little slower to react to the yeast. Now that being said, neither one of them are very likely to make you sick, other than a generic old yeast infection, which you've all had a yeast infection, whether you think so or not, because diaper rash is a yeast infection. And when you were all babies, you all had diaper rash at some point. So you've all had a yeast infection, not a big deal. The ones that actually are very dangerous fungi are what we call dimorphic. So I bet you can kind of tell me what that word means. What does it mean to morph? Change. What does di mean? Two. So a dimorphic fungus, what do you think it can change between? A mold and a yeast. Okay? So there are some that can choose which type they want to be depending on their outside surroundings. And one of the most common things that is kind of the trigger to change them back and forth is temperature. Some of the ones that make us sick, they are a mold at room temperature. Why would they want to be a mold? What are molds very good at? Reproducing fast, right? So let's say this dangerous mold is growing on the desk, right? Where are its spores going to be? All in the air, right? So as those spores are in the air and I'm standing here running my mouth, what am I doing? Oh, right on cue. You sneeze for me to breathe that into, right? I'm inhaling those spores. As I inhale the spores, does the temperature inside my body change from the outside temperature? It's warmer in my body, right? That spore, once it gets in my body, will morph into the yeast form. And my immune system may not pick it up quite as fast. And then that yeast can start growing in my body. Then when it comes back out of my body, one way or another, it's going to come back out. It can turn back into a mold, make millions of spores again, infect new people. And we're going to look at some examples that are like that we're going to talk about later in the semester are Cryptococcus, Coccidioides, and some of you probably never heard those terms before. But if you're going into the medical field, you're going to learn them. You're going to learn what those infections are, and that is mainly because AIDS is now becoming such a pandemic on our earth. Lots of AIDS patients are going to have those pretty nasty dimorphic fungal infections, and you'll learn what they look like because of that. Okay. So does that make sense? Guys could tell me the difference between them, molds and yeast? Okay. Now, so let's talk a little bit more about how these molds and these yeasts have adapted to live in some kind of crazy environments. Okay? And that matters a lot. A lot of our yeast especially are partial acidophiles. What does that mean? They like acidic conditions. A lot of them, especially the yeast, prefer pHs down below 6, somewhere between 5 and 6. Are there any parts of your body that are a little bit more acidic than others? Okay. Typically, vaginal secretions are going to be a little bit lower than 7, and that's probably a yeast's favorite place to live. Sometimes inside of the mouth will have a slightly lower pH. Yeast like to grow in there too. What do we call a yeast infection in the mouth? Anybody know? What babies get? Thrush. Yeah, hey, that's the exact same yeast that can grow in the vagina, growing in the mouth. It's the exact same thing. I even knew a lady that got a yeast infection in her mammary glands from breastfeeding her child while her child had thrush and not realizing it, and she ended up with her mammary glands infected. It was really horrific looking. I would never. But anyway, so they sometimes like lower pHs. Something really neat, and there's some other stuff right on your slide, but something really neat about them is they're pretty cool with low moisture conditions. They can live in places that no other living thing can live because of a lack of water. Okay? And some of the things written on your slide I think would surprise a lot of you. Now the first one written on your slide says bathroom walls. Well, that's pretty obvious. You all know that mold can grow in your bathroom, right? What do you call it? Mildew. Mildew is just mold. Okay? And I know your bathroom wall, it gets wet, right? Does it say wet all the time? No. They can live on that bathroom wall for several days. So let's say you take a shower and you go on vacation. Is that wall of your bathroom or the wall of your tub going to get wet for the next week you're gone on vacation? No. Hope not. Hope nobody's there taking a shower, right? That mildew, that mold, it can live on that shower wall for over a week without any moisture coming in contact with it. It's really resistant to that. Molds can live on newspapers. They can live inside of leather and shoes. Sometimes if you get a really funky, stinky shoe, it can be because you have mildew growing in your shoe. Nothing else on earth can live on shoe leather. Okay? A lot of animals, dog toys, are made of leather because supposedly it's hard for them to tear it up. But those toys get really nasty and you can't wash them. They're so nasty because you got fungus growing on them. So just something to kind of think about. I already told you it's behind your ears. Okay? So the next slide in your notes, just to give you some things that I think are kind of interesting, I want to make sure no matter how much we talk about this, how much we go over it, I don't make you think at any point that all of these guys we're talking about are bad. I know sometimes the bad part is the more fun stuff to talk about. But there's a lot of really neat things we use fungi for. And the first one on this sheet, Aspergillus niger, we use that to make citric acid for our food. That's a food preservation. So we intentionally put a mold in some of our food to keep it from spoiling. What are we trying to keep from growing? Bacteria. The citric acid makes the pH go down a little bit, so the fungus can live there, but the bacteria can't. Okay, so that's something good we use them for. Saccharomyces, that is the yeast that you can buy at Walmart. Have you ever seen the little dry packages of yeast? That's Saccharomyces. That's what we use to make wine and bread and things like that. That's also what we use to make the hepatitis B vaccine. So if any of you have ever had a hepatitis B vaccine, that was made by a Saccharomyces, the same guy that made your bread you ate for lunch. He was injected with the protein, he grew, produced the vaccine, and when they gave you the shot, they gave you pieces of that yeast with it. Okay? The last two on here, I would never really test you. I just think they're really neat. There is a mold called Taxomyces, and I can't remember the researcher's name now off the top of my head, but there was a guy, he was doing cancer research, and he actually purified a component from this mold that we now use in a cancer drug called Taxol. If you've ever known anybody that had cancer, you've probably heard of this drug. And it is simply just something we took out of the mold. The mold didn't know why it was making it. We just figured out it has anti-cancer effects. And then the Plecomyces, they are what we use to treat termites. Okay? We used to treat termites by coming and putting really harsh, nasty chemicals in your house. And then, anybody ever had their house when you were a kid treated for termites? If you remember it, you were probably told that you had to leave your house for several days, and when you came back, you weren't supposed to touch certain things around your house. It's because of the chemicals. We don't do that anymore. Now we can just go spray a fungus, I think it's a mold, spray the mold, insert it into the ground. The mold can't hurt you at all, but it kills the termites. It's much better than a nasty chemical, right? Okay. So just kind of some neat things that I found about fungi that I thought you would think was interesting too. Okay? So our next little eukaryote we need to talk about a little bit are algae. And for a while in my classes, I didn't really talk about algae because they're not super exciting. But then I realized we do some things with algae kind of on an everyday basis. And I thought, well, you know, maybe they would like to know some of these things. Now, the first thing to go over is to tell you that algae are photoautotrophs. Okay, so that's kind of the opposite of the chemoheterotrophs. Photoautotroph means algae uses sunlight to produce their own food. What else does that sound like? Sounds like plants, right? Photosynthesis. But algae are not plants. Even though some of them look like they've got a stem with a big old leaf on the end of it, they are not plants. And that, you go down to the molecular level, they really don't look anything like plants. And I would never test you on structure, but they don't call them leaves, they call them blades. They don't call them stems, they call them, I think, shoots or something like that. They're not plants. They do photosynthesis and they produce oxygen. They actually produce more oxygen that we use every day than plants do. So it's very important, but it's just important to understand that they are not plants. We categorize the algae pretty much by what they look like, basically mostly by what color they are. Okay, we have 5 major groups, and then got one extra guy that's kind of been added since I've been in school. The 5 major groups are the green ones, the red ones, the brown ones, the ones that look like little creatures, and the ones that look like little pieces of glass. Okay, I'm going to give you the real names too. That's your 5 major groups, and then the new guy that's been added. Okay, so let me go in the order that's on your sheet so you can keep up with me. So our first ones are the brown algae. They are big. They are what we kind of more often would call a kelp. And if you've ever been at the beach and you saw giant leaves, I'm calling them leaves, giant blades on your seaweed that you saw, then you may have seen brown algae. Now the stuff that was brown in color but looked more like the stem of grapes, if you took all the grapes off of it, you know what the stem of your grapes would look like? That's more of what the seaweed you saw at the beach probably looked like. That's not brown algae, that's green algae. That's your seaweed. It looks brown because it's dead when it washes up on the shore. Okay? So you most likely haven't really come in contact with any brown algae at the beach. But every one of you already today have used something that has brown algae in it. We get something from brown algae called algin. Algin is found in ice cream, hand lotion, and tires. It's a pretty broad spectrum of things, right? Okay? All it is, it's a thickener. So we put a little bit of it in our ice cream. What's the difference between homemade ice cream and if you go buy a tub of ice cream at Walmart? The thickness of it, right? Homemade ice cream is much runnier, right? You go buy it at Walmart, it's so hard you got to microwave the crap before you can get it out of the container, right? It's because they put algin in it. That same thickener, we just put a little bit more of it in our rubber tires and in our hand lotion. But it's all the same thing. Okay? The next one on the list, the red algae. That's something that you've probably never seen. Red algae lives deep, deep in the ocean. And it is not something you would come in contact with in a normal life, but every one of you have come in contact with it because of what we get from it. From our red algae, we get something called agar. And if you've ever seen in the microbiology lab a media that was solid, it was solid because it had agar in it. Okay? And if it wasn't for red algae, we would not have that. Okay? Green algae, they're the ones that are green. It's the ones you come in contact with. Anything that looked like scum in a water fountain or a pond or a fish tank, that was old green algae. Okay? It's kind of a nuisance, but it does make oxygen for us. The next ones are the ones that are a little bit more interesting. Okay? Our next group are the ones I said looked like little pieces of glass. They're called diatoms. So if you look at your little picture, I think I have a nice little circular one on your slide. They look like glass because they have silica incorporated into them. And that's what we make glass from. To make glass or a mirror, we take silica and we compress it under pressure, and that's how we make that. These little guys are just naturally made like that, and they're pretty important to us. Okay? Where did you learn when you were in elementary school that fossil fuels came from? The dinosaurs, right? That just sounds way cooler. Fossil fuels came from diatoms, little tiny little pieces of algae dying and being compressed deep down in the earth over millions of years. That's where we get gasoline from. That's where we get oil from. It was really not from the dinosaurs. It was from these teeny tiny little guys. This is just doesn't sound as cool as saying that it came from the dinosaurs. Okay? So is it true that we're going to run out of oil one day? Possibly. But we still have diatoms. Oil is still being produced deep down in the earth. We're just now using it at a much faster rate than it is being made. Okay, so people like to make it sound like it came from the dinosaurs, and since we have no more dinosaurs, we can't make it anymore, right? Not true. We're still making it deep down in the earth. We're just using it faster than it's being made. Okay, but we're not going to have a political discussion. All right, last little group were the group that I said looked like little critters. And they do. That's the one, if you look in your pictures, has the little flagella. They swim around. They swim right at the top of the water supply. You just can't see them because they're microscopic. For the most part, they don't hurt us. But every now and then, they can produce something that is called paralytic shellfish poisoning or red tide. You ever heard of that? We have red tides on the coast every now and then. They don't hurt you. But if a fish ingests too much of that poison, or a shellfish ingests too much of that poison, it can kill the fish or kill the shellfish. And if you guys have subscribed to my YouTube account, there's lots of videos on there that I've kind of collected, and there's several of them that show you how certain countries can just be completely devastated by red tide and the shellfish poisoning, and where these little villages, like every bit of their income and their survival comes from their ability to fish. And you can see the videos of just hundreds of thousands of dead fish just being washed onto shore from these little dinoflagellates killing everything. Okay? And our last group are the ones that have just kind of been added here recently. They are called the oomycota, the slime molds. And some of you may have seen this and not really known what it was. If you've ever had fish tanks, have you ever had that fish that died and when you pulled him out he kind of looked like he had some fur growing on him? Have any of y'all ever seen that? That is the water mold. And the reason your fish is dead is because that mold, that it's not really a mold, it shouldn't be called water mold, is because that algae attacked him and it killed the fish. It doesn't happen to big fish, but it's a pretty serious problem for little fish, even naturally. Okay? I'm sorry, I don't get bored. We're going to watch the videos at the end. Just don't have a projector. Okay, so we already talked about that. All right, so we got two more groups to talk about. The third group are the protozoa. These are my favorites, so I probably ask more questions about them than I do some of the others. The protozoa are just amazing little guys. All of the protozoa are unicellular. They're just one little cell, just like the yeast are, but these are way cooler than the yeast. Yeast are just cells and they don't do a whole lot. Protozoa can do almost anything they want to. Some of the protozoa have rudimentary digestive systems. Some of them have nervous systems. Some of them have eyes that can sense sunlight, and they can do all of these things being just one little cell. When we get to diseases, you'll see the protozoan diseases, and they don't all cause disease, but the ones that do, they're pretty nasty. And that's because they can live in two forms. They can exist as what we call a trophozoite, or a cyst. The trophozoite is the living, happy, feeding form of the protozoan, and he's all happy doing his own thing, living. They're chemoheterotrophs. They eat other things. They're like little animals. But here's the cool part. If this guy gets in danger, he can turn into a cyst What does this remind you of? Endospore. Okay? And then when the conditions get better, that cyst can pop right back and become a trophozoite again. Okay? What's really neat is that trophozoite is large compared to its cyst. So it can keep just the information it needs and form a very small microscopic cyst. Now these guys are microscopic too, but their cyst is much smaller. In the trophozoite, it has two parts. There's the ectoplasm and the endoplasm. Inside of the endoplasm, that's where you have all of the organelles. You'll have a nucleus and the ER. You'll have your mitochondria. Everything that makes it a eukaryotic cell is protected inside of that endoplasm. The ectoplasm is a completely fluid portion of the cell. The fluid portion allows this guy the ability to move. And that's actually how we categorize the protozoa, is by how they move. One option they have is some of them have one really, really long tail-like piece that can whip. So what would that be called? A eukaryotic flagella, right? Okay. Some of them, instead of having flagella, will have a whole bunch of teeny tiny little projections sticking out that look like hairs. So what would those be? Cilia. Okay, the one that's a little bit harder maybe. Is some of them can, when they want to move in one direction, they can pull all their ectoplasm one way and grow a large piece out that can grab a hold, and then they can slide the rest of their body this way, and then extend a new piece out down here, grab a hold, and suck their whole body that way. What's that fake arm, fake foot coming out called? A pseudopod. Good, very good. You remember something from biology class, right? A pseudopod, usually it doesn't get the credit it deserves when you first learn what they are. They just teach you that it's a false foot and they can make it when they want to. How neat is that? I am a cell and I'm just hanging out here, and somebody decides they're going to spray something right here that's going to kill me. So just suck all of my body in, stick it out this way, grab a hold, suck and move this way. That's pretty good, right? And then if it's still here, whoop, let me just come out here and move this way. Now, it's not they're not going to win any races by doing it that way. And I've got a video I'm going to show you guys in a minute of how they can do that. But it's just so cool that they can just morph their body into a new shape so they can move and go wherever they want to go. Really, really neat. Okay? So since their movement is such an important part of their lives, that's how we're going to categorize them. As far as reproduction, it can get really fancy, so we're not going to learn all the little parts of it, but I want to go ahead and tell you a little bit of it because it's going to be important when we get to the disease parts. Okay? Some of them reproduce by mitosis. Okay, so that's just asexual reproduction, right? One cell becomes two cells. That's not really exciting. But here's what's neat. If I'm a protozoan, while I'm hanging out right here in this part of my life, let me just reproduce on mitosis. That's good. I'm not worried about doing anything any fancier. Okay? Then switch. I'm in the next part of my life cycle. Now let's say I'm a parasite and I've moved from over there, and I'm now moved into a human body. Different form, different shape. Well, I'm ready. I need to reproduce really fast now. So then I switch and I start reproducing a different way. Now I'm going to reproduce by something called zygogony. In zygogony, you have your one cell. Okay? He's got his nucleus with his DNA in it. Okay? What he'll do is he'll keep making new copies of his DNA. They'll make up to 20, 30 copies of their DNA all inside of the one original cell. And then when the time is right, let's say that stupid human I'm inside of right now, their immune system's not watching right now, so then I'll burst open, and that one cell just became 40 cells. And now 40 new parasites are running around inside of this human, and they're going to run and go into the new part of the human body where they're going to infect it. Now that they're there, hey, let's change a little bit. They start reproducing sexually. And now that parasite can change a little bit and become a little bit different parasite. That's pretty smart for one cell to be able to change the way it reproduces, right? How do humans reproduce? asexually, right? Do we have an option? No, right? If I want to have a baby, sperm has to meet an egg, right? I can't just decide, oh, I don't really have a husband or a boyfriend right now, so I'm just going to reproduce asexually right now. I think that's just what I'm going to decide to do, okay? They can do that. They can just decide how they want to reproduce and switch it whenever it seems good. We're going to see this when we get to Plasmodium, the cause of malaria. And that's why malaria is such a tricky disease. You can have malaria for a month and not have a single symptom, and that's because he's hiding doing this. He's doing cyzogony in your liver. He's reproducing and waiting and waiting and waiting until he has an army, and then he dispenses the army into your blood supply and starts eating your red blood cells with this massive army, instead of one little guy trying to reproduce and eat your red blood cells one at a time. It's really, really neat. Okay? All right. So our next slide has some pictures of our 5 different groups. We have 5 different groups based off of how they move. The first group, the diplomonads, they are some of our flagellated, flagellated protozoa, but they're the simple ones. And by simple, I mean they don't have quite as many organelles. They actually lack a mitochondria. And we're going to talk about these. You don't have to know the diseases now, but this is the group that causes Giardia and Trichomonas. Okay, Giardia is explosive diarrhea. Okay, and we'll learn a little bit more about that later. But I bet some of you have heard of Trichomonas, right? So you're shaking your head and smiling. Why are you smiling? What's funny about Trichomonas? It's a sexually transmitted disease that makes you smell like a fish. And not a good, healthy fish. A nice, rotten, stinky fish. Especially when, y'all giggle. But when women have Trichomonas, they smell so strongly that if I had it, and I said if I had it, and I was standing here, everybody on the front row would be able to smell it. It's wonderful. And the people that are grinning at me are my MLT students over there, because they've probably had to smell this at some point, or either they're laughing because they realize one day they're going to have to smell that. Because when they take a sample of stuff and send it back to the lab, the poor guys in the MLT lab are the ones that have to run that test on it. And so they're going to get something that smells so strongly, they're all immediately in the room going to know what it is. They still have to hold their nose and run that test to verify what it is. Isn't that the way it works? Right? Okay. It is so bad, and I'm not making a joke, I can walk through Walmart and be standing there trying to find the one stupid can of soup that I'm looking for amongst the 5 million types of soup on the, you know what I'm talking about, right? I've all been looking at that one can of soup. So you're standing there like an idiot reading the cans of soup, trying to find the one you're looking for, and somebody walks up next to you and they're doing the same thing. Trichomonas is so bad when somebody walks up next to me, I can smell it and know that they have Trichomonas, and I just have to walk away. Because once you smell it and you know what it smells like, you will walk through Walmart and you will smell somebody that has Trichomonas. Am I exaggerating? Those of you that know what it smells like? It's very, very bad. That is a little flagellated protozoan. Okay? The second group on your sheet, the Euglenozoa, they're the other ones that are flagellated. They're the fancier ones. Some of them have an eyeball. Okay? And you think, no, there's no way a single cell can have an eyeball. Think about what your eye does. Your eye takes light, right? The light goes into your eyeball, activates neurons, and allows you to see, right? Well, they have a spot on their one cell that's colored, so it can sense certain wavelengths of light and respond to it. It's exactly what you do with your eyeballs, right? They have an eye. Other ones that live off of blood cause things like African sleeping sickness, where a little bug bites you. Okay, he gives you the little Euglenozoa, the protozoa, and gets into your blood, starts eating your red blood cells. The next day you fall into a coma, and then you die from African sleeping sickness. A very closely related guy is trypanosomiasis. It's also called Chagas disease. That's the same thing in South America. Bug bites you, you fall into a coma, you die. Okay, all from these little protozoa. All right, the third group, the amoebas. How do you think they move? What is an amoeba? How does an amoeba move? Pseudopods. That's the guy they showed you in biology class that could make the pseudopods. Most of the amoeba are free living. They live in your water. You drink them every day. If y'all don't believe me, we'll go get some water out the water fountain and we'll put it on a microscope and you can watch the little guys swim around in the microscope. They're always in your water. They don't hurt you. Some of them can make you sick, though. Okay. The fourth group, Apicomplexa, they do not move at all. They are the ones that cause really nasty diseases like malaria, toxoplasmosis, and we'll talk about all these as we get further along. Our last group of protozoa are the Ciliophora. They're the group that move by cilia. Only one of those is actually a human parasite. Those guys are pretty harmless. I'm going to show you some videos of all these moving around in just a second. Okay? So let's flip to our last slide, and let's get a little bit of basic information about our last group, the helminths. The helminths are animals. So why on earth are we talking about animals in microbiology class? There's not possibly an animal that's microscopic, and there isn't. All animals you can see with the naked eye. Okay? I actually have, here, I'll pull one out right now. Here is a parasitic helminth. It's a worm. Came out of a human. Is he microscopic? He's dripping on the floor too. That's gross. I mean, he's obviously not microscopic, right? So why are we talking about him in here? Other than I think they're really awesome. He started out microscopic. When they are transmitted from one human to another, they are microscopic. So all those stupid YouTube videos of, hey, look at the tapeworm in the meat I bought at the grocery store, that's not real. You can't see them when they are in the form that they can infect you. They grow into that once they get in your body where they want to be. Okay? They are typically, we're going to just kind of focus on the parasitic ones because we all know that all worms aren't parasitic, right? Can an earthworm infect you? No, they live in the dirt, right? So we're going to focus more on the parasitic ones. Most of your parasitic worms, they actually eat whatever tissue they live in. Okay, so if it's a heart fluke, a heartworm, what's he going to eat? Your heart tissue, the muscle of your heart, or the blood flowing through your heart. Okay? If it's a tapeworm living in your intestines, what's he going to eat? He's going to eat your food the food you're digesting for him, or eventually your intestinal wall. That's what they're going to eat. They eat wherever they live. Most of them that are parasites have really become specialized to be good parasites. So they've spent more of their time focusing on evolving and adapting the body systems they need the most, like their reproductive systems are usually really complex. Think about it this way. If I'm a tapeworm hanging out inside of somebody's intestines, is it really likely that a mate for me is going to come floating along any day now? No, you usually just get one tapeworm. So they've learned how to reproduce by themselves. They've really adapted their reproductive systems because that's what they needed to spend time on. Things like their nervous system, their digestive systems, their ability to move, those sorts of things have not evolved quite as much, and they've actually become what we call reduced over time. They just not as fancy. Okay? So we've got two groups of worms we're going to learn about. We're going to learn about the platyhelminths, and I know the word looks bad, but it's not. I'm probably spelling it wrong. But platyhelminths, these are flatworms. There's two groups in the platyhelminths. There are cestodes and trematodes. Cestodes are tapeworms, and trematodes are flukes. So now we're getting into some words you've heard before, right? Fluke and tapeworm. Why do you think they're called flatworms? They are super flat. They're flattened dorsal-ventrally, meaning belly to back. It looks like somebody has taken something and flattened them. And when I show you the colonoscopy videos, I show you the live flatworms. I'm going to show you some real ones too. It's amazing how flat they can be. All of your flatworms, important characteristic, they are hermaphrodites. What's a hermaphrodite? They have testicles and ovaries inside of every worm. here's the really cool part. Okay? So in a tapeworms are long. They're actually segmented. They have lots of big segments. Each one of these segments is called a proglottid. Okay? In each little segment, they'll have a set of ovaries, and then they'll have a set of testicles in each little segment. The set of testicles can produce sperm. They can come over here and fertilize their own eggs and produce a new one. That's pretty impressive. They can reproduce by themselves. They don't need any help. At the very end of the tapeworm, I'm not an artist, but at the very end of the tapeworm kind of expands. This is called the head of the tapeworm, the scolex. Okay? At the end, he's got a sucker and these really sharp little spikes sticking out of the end of his sucker. That is so he can take those spikes and bury them into the wall of your intestine and hold on. Why does he need to hold on? Stuff's moving through, right? He doesn't want to get pooped out. You don't poop out a tapeworm. He's holding on in there. He just keeps on growing, and your poo just flows right on past him. All he's got to do is just hold on and lay there. And you just digest the food, and you float the digested food over him, and he can absorb everything he needs and just hang out in your body. The record tapeworm that was removed from a living human, anybody have any ideas how long it was? No, that's not true. Oh, well, it depends. Okay, let me answer my first question, then I'll answer y'all's question. The record is 23 feet long. So how long is 23 feet long? This room is about 30 feet long. So that means inside of a person's body, there was a worm that would stretch from that wall to about right here. Could you imagine? Right, I have a tapeworm to show you guys in a few minutes. All right, so if you've got one that size in your body, they're going to have to do surgery. They give you medicine to kill them. All right. If you just have little bitty ones, they give you medicine, kill them, and you just poop them out. But if you've got a big one, they'll kill them and then have to do surgery to physically remove them from the body. Okay. Back in the 1970s, you could buy a little pill. You still can, but you got to get it from Mexico now. You buy a little pill that had a tapeworm in it, and you would take it. Why'd you want to do that? It's a diet plan. Now we know, though, that once you get really skinny and they run out of stuff to eat, they leave your intestines and go to your brain and eat your brain. It's not really a good diet plan. But people used to do it all the time. All right, okay, we got a lot. We're going to talk a lot about tapeworms later. We're going to talk about them some more when we get to diseases. Okay, so a fluke is just a small guy. He just has one little part to his body, testicles and ovaries in his body. So he can do the same thing. He's a hermaphrodite. But he has two different suckers. He doesn't really have any teeth, but he has two suckers. He uses one sucker to hold on, and the other sucker, he will spit out little things that can digest. Like if he's a lung fluke, he'll spit out little stuff that kind of digests the wall of your lungs, and he uses his other sucker to suck in the digested piece of your lung that he's focused on eating at that moment. So kind of similar, but they look different, so we separate them. Our other big group of worms, they're called the nematodes, phylum Nematoda. Okay? They're the round ones. They're different. They're not hermaphroditic. They have a male and a female. The female worm is quite large, and the male worm, he's a little bitty turd of a guy. Okay? I think I drew my symbols right. So female's much bigger than the male, but they have to actually reproduce. They have sex with each other. I'm not drawing on the board, but the male worm has a little projection called a spicule at the very end of his body. He actually has to inject the spicule into the female worm, insert sperm inside of her body to make new offspring. So the two groups are very different, other than these are flat and these are round. But okay. So y'all want to see some videos?